Today's webinar is entitled Demographics or Destiny: How Demographic Trends Are Reshaping Florida and the United States. This is the first in what we hope will be a series of webinars hosted by the APA Florida chapter and developed by the Emerging Topics Committee. I'm Lindsay Stevens. I'm the chair of the Emerging Topics Committee, and before we get started today, I just want to take a minute to thank the members of the Emerging Topics Committee. These folks have been working tirelessly over the past year to engage APA Florida membership and other planners across the U.S. to identify critical issues that we believe will impact the planning profession in Florida and beyond over the next 1 to 2 decades. The Emerging Topics Committee is working to locate resources and needed initiatives that the APA Florida membership and the planning community can access and utilize in their work moving forward. If you have suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to one of the Emerging Topics members. We're going to have a link on the APA Florida website to members that can hopefully integrate your input and feedback on this webinar and other topical areas. I also want to note that this webinar would not be possible, and the APA Emerging Topics Committee, quite honestly, would not exist without support from the APA Florida Executive Committee, and in particular, the current APA Florida President, Melissa Zornita, who helped establish this committee a little over a year and a half ago. Before I introduce today's presenter, I just have a few housekeeping issues to cover. We're currently testing out the Fuse software that you've signed in on today. We really don't anticipate any technical difficulties, but if they do occur, please do bear with us. We'll try to resolve them as quickly as possible. This presentation is being recorded and it will be available in the future for reference on the APA Florida website, so please keep an eye out for a link. This webinar has been approved for 1 hour of CM credits. Your invitation to join the webinar today included the information for obtaining CM credit. Please do avail yourself of that, since I know AICP members want to get as many credit hours as possible. We do welcome your questions today. You are currently on mute, so we cannot hear you. Please type your questions in the chat box, and it's really easy to do this. Simply click on the chat balloon, and that's located on the bottom of your screen. And it's the second link over on the right-hand side. Looks like a little text box. Type your question in, and we'll be happy to pass your question on to the presenter. We're going to answer questions at the end of the presentation just to make sure that we cover all of the material today. So please know that, that the chat box is being monitored. We're pleased to have Dr. Tim Chapin join us today for our inaugural webinar. Dr. Chapin is the interim dean of the Florida State University College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, and he's also the professor of urban and regional planning. Since he joined FSU in 1999, Dr. Chapin has undertaken research on the effectiveness of Florida's growth management system and the role of sports facilities in the promotion of urban redevelopment. He's a noted expert on land use and comprehensive planning, growth management, and urban redevelopment. Dr. Chapin's current research interests revolve around how Florida's demographic trends influence urban patterns and transportation systems in the state. He serves as the Senior Associate Editor and Review Editor for the Journal of the American Planning Association. He holds a BA in Sociology from Emory University, a Master's in City and Regional Planning from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and a PhD in Urban Design and Planning from the University of Washington. Today, Dr. Chapin will speak with us about significant demographic trends occurring within the state of Florida and across the United States. These trends will have a significant impact on the communities that we as professional planners both live in and plan for. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Chapin.
Thank you, Professor Stevens, for the introduction. Thanks to the APA Florida staff for the invitation to share with you some talking points about demographics today. I'm excited to be here for the inaugural Emerging Topics Seminar, and hopefully you enjoy the talk. I've got lots of slides to get through, lots of graphics. I'm more than happy to make this presentation available through the APA Florida website, so we'll work with the staff to make sure that the presentation as well as the recorded session is up there and available to you. One of the points I wanted to get across today is this basic idea that we live in a very, very complex, very, very fast-changing world. We talk about climate change, we talk about transportation changes, we talk about all sorts of things going on in the world that are well beyond our control, that are in many ways unknowable. It's a very complicated world in which we live, and the policy environment is constantly shifting. The climate is literally shifting by the day. What I wanted to get across today is sort of the point that in the area of demographics, we actually have some certainty, and I wanted to talk about the certainty regarding our demographic destiny somewhat today. In a world in which we've got a lot of sort of unknowns, there are some knowns in this area of demographics. That really is the theme for the day's talk. So I want to talk demographics or destiny, how demographic trends are reshaping Florida and the United States. I'm a big believer in sort of getting across my points up front. I sort of go with a good Southern preacher approach to making presentations. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you, and then at the end, I'm going to tell you what I told you. So is, oh, are we?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're with a little technical changes here, but I think we're back and going here. Demographics or destiny, continued browning of Florida in the U.S. That's an ongoing trend. There's no getting around that. And then some household and changes as well. So those are the big themes for the day. Let me start into the slideshow. I got a lot of slides, and I'll try to move through them relatively efficiently here. First of all, let's talk about growth. This slide shows historic U.S. population growth. We're now about 315, 320 million folks in the United States. The Census Bureau does a good job sort of tracking our current population. The country's been growing since our first census back in 1790 and will continue to do so. What's interesting, as I go to the next slide, is that we are growing and are expected to add our next 100 million folks by the middle of the 2040s. So sometime between now and about 2050, we're going to hit 400 million U.S. residents. What's interesting about that is we're going to continue to grow due to natural increase. We're going to continue to see more births than deaths. And our population will grow because of that. That's called natural increase in the realm of demographics. But an interesting trend as projected by the Census Bureau is that we're also going to see anticipated growth due to international migration. Although with the upcoming presidential election, who knows? But for now, the projections suggest that our population is going to grow not just from natural increase, but also international migration. And that trend is sort of set to continue. The U.S. is a destination of choice for millions of people around the globe, and that will continue to shape our population moving forward. The state of Florida, as for those of us that have worked and lived in the state have seen, has grown remarkably over the last century and a half. If you look at our current numbers, we're pushing at about 20 million Floridians now, probably a little above that. The rule of thumb I give is that since 1960, we've added about 3 million people a decade every single decade. Fortunately, we're starting to slow down, and we're probably going to only add about 2.6, 2.7 million people a decade for the next few decades. So, you know, our growth is slowing down, but it's really not. We're still adding lots and lots of folks to the state population. In terms of Florida's growth, there's been some concern, at least until relatively recently, that the state had slowed down. There was a big sort of to-do back in the late 2000s in which the national economy had slowed, the housing bust happened, and Florida actually almost slowed to no growth for a few years. And there was a lot of talk about, is that a new Florida? Is that the new trend? The reality is that it was a short-term, massive, but short-term blip in the economy. There was a massive market correction, but the state has continued to grow. And again, the magic number of 2.5 to 2.6 million people a decade, about 250,000, 260,000 people on average in a given year are expected to come to Florida in terms of net growth for the foreseeable future. If you look sort of at Florida versus the rest of the United States, again, much of the Sun Belt is growing, much of the Intermountain West and West Coast is growing. This is a graphic by the Census Bureau looking at population growth rates by state. And again, the big message here is if you're around the country, you can see how your state has fared in the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. The big message here is that Florida has been a sort of a national leader in its growth and continues to be, which is both a great a joy and somewhat of a challenge for the state. In terms of another nice graphic here by the Census Bureau is change in population by county. So if you look, this is another nice graphic out of a report done recently, the growth in the 2000s. The big message here is that you can see that Florida is largely in the green. The green shades are counties that have been experiencing growth. The darker the green, the greater the growth. You can see across the nation sort of those counties that are growing. The big story here is again Sun Belt, Intermountain West, and West are growing. The Northeast, the Upper Midwest, and then sort of the Midwest have been growing, or in many cases, growing less slowly or in decline. The big story here, as I mentioned, is that Florida is going to continue to grow, and this is something that we're excited about, although it is a challenge for our schools, our water supply systems, our transportation networks, and so on. Um, when I give this talk in a public setting, I oftentimes do little pop quizzes. I won't pop quiz you because I can't hear your answers and see your hands go up. But I will say that if we look at Florida in terms of our elderly population, our percent that's foreign born, there's some very interesting statistics that really do influence the state and how it works. In 2010, Florida's elderly population, and elderly is older adults age 65 and older, about 3.5 million. Roughly 1 in 5 Floridians were age 65 and older. Roughly 1 in 5 Floridians were foreign born, so we're an old state. We've got a wonderfully diverse mix of residents. 1 in 5 residents are foreign born. And a particular challenge for certain parts of the state is 1 in 4 households did not speak English as their primary language at home, which makes for an exciting and interesting and diverse, but sometimes challenging environment for planners to work in. So some interesting statistics out of the demographics for the state of Florida. These are some of the themes that I now want to turn my attention to as I move forward in the presentation. First of all, the silver tsunami, inverting the population pyramid, and I'll talk about what that means here in a minute. We hear a lot about the baby boom generation, and what I've got on the screen now is a slide from the National Center for Health Statistics that tracks the number of U.S. live births from 1910 through about 2008. And what's really wonderful about this slide is it shows you sort of the greatest generation, the silent generation, the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, and the millennials. And the big message here is that post World War II, there was a massive rise in the number of babies being born in the U.S. Our baby boomers, 1946 through 1964, that's their generational cohort. And it was a very, very large sort of bulge in the population that we'll see in some population pyramids in a little bit that has very much shaped our consumption patterns, our housing units, our built environment since that generation sort of came to be here in the U.S. The baby boomers were followed by what was called the baby bust, the Gen Xers. It's not that that generation was a bust, it's just that the number of live births was down in the period 1965 through about 1985. And then we've got this new millennial generation, and I think that will then transition to a new generation that's as yet unnamed. And you can see that the baby boomers across the top there, about 79 million, 80 million baby boomers. It's worth noting that our millennial generation is actually larger than that in size. But let's talk about those baby boomers. Those folks are now entering their retirement years. Back in 2011 was sort of the first beginnings of the baby boom generation entering their 65 and older traditional retirement age. We think of Florida as a retirement destination. We think of Florida as aging rapidly, but what this slide that should be in front of you now shows is that every state is experiencing growth in their silver tsunami or their older adult population. Florida is expected to see its grow by about 50% in the next decade, 2010 to 2020. Other states actually have higher growth rates, but every state is expecting to see a substantial increase in their older adult population. So Florida's not alone in this. If we zoom beyond the state down to the county level, again, this is data out of our friends at the Census Bureau. We can see the 65 and older population percent change in the last decade, 2000 to 2010, by county. And again, the big message there is that Florida is largely in the blue, which means that we have a fast-growing older adult population. So you can see that the South, the Sun Belt, the Southeast, the Intermountain West, and the West are the bluer shades, although much of the country is experiencing growth in that population cohort. One of my favorite ways of analyzing population is through a thing called the population pyramid. And I saw the registration list for the webinar before we started up here. I see lots of former students out there. They're used to hearing me talk about population pyramids. I usually tear up when I talk about them. I'll try not to. But population pyramids are a wonderful way of showing a population makeup by age and sex. What we have is an Excel graphic that will have the males on the left-hand side, females on the right-hand side, and age groups go from the youngest at the bottom to the oldest at the top. Let me go to the next slide, and I'll show you why we call these things population pyramids. This is the age, sex, population makeup of the US, the national population at the 1900 census, and you can see why we call it a population pyramid. What we've got is the youngest age cohorts at the bottom, the oldest at the top. We've got males on the left side in green, females on the right side in a yellowish. And again, you can see that back in those days, we had lots and lots of kids, and with each successive generation, we saw a drop off sort of in that cohort size. This is sort of the origin of the term population pyramid. By 1950, the population pyramid began to look a little different. We saw, you can see sort of a hollowing out in the teenage years there related to the Great Depression and sort of the impact on cohort sizes. You can see literally the beginning of the baby boom generation in that very bottommost cohort, 0 to 5-year-olds. That's the baby boomers there, but still a relatively thin top. So we can see how socioeconomic forces were shaping demographic trends in 1950. And if we zoom ahead to the year 2000 population pyramid for the US as a whole, we no longer really have a population pyramid, but some sort of modern sculpture in which we can pick out some of the demographic forces that work in the United States. There's a bulge in the age cohorts of about 35 to 45-year-olds. That's your baby boomers. Below that, in the cohorts of about 20 to 30-year-olds, there's a bit of a hollowing. That's some of the baby bust. And then we can see sort of some of the other demographic cohorts below that. You'll notice that the 2000 pyramid is a lot thicker at the top than it was in 1950, and certainly than it was in 1900. That's because we're living longer, we're living more healthfully, and this is a really wonderful thing. So we're aging and living longer lives, and we can see that in that population pyramid. I want to just sort of show you that these pyramids do vary tremendously as you zoom around the world. This is the US population pyramid in the year 2010. And again, you can see that baby boom generation in the 45 to 60-year-old or 45 to 50-year-old cohort. So there's the US. Just to give you a sense, this is the 2010 population pyramid for India, a still very much developing, fast developing country. Some interesting things here are just worth noting. It's much more male dominated than female dominated. There's some cultural reasons for that. But you can see this one looks a lot more like a pyramid as they are sort of developing as a country, and their economy is developing and their public health system is developing. And then the last one I'll show you just to give you a sense that these things differ is this is the German population pyramid for 2010. This is actually a country that's in demographic crisis. Germany, France, Japan, Italy. Some of these developed countries are very top heavy, and they're actually worried about their production of children, bluntly put. They're encouraging people to have more kids. They are relying almost solely on international migration to grow as a nation because of their demographic changes. But this is a very top-heavy population pyramid. So just to show you, these things vary by country around the globe. I now want to take you through a little bit of a history of Florida's population pyramid because it helps to show some of the changes that we've experienced as a state. The graphic on the screen now is the Florida population pyramid from 1970. And again, just to remind you, males are on the left, now in blue, females on the right in red. The youngest age cohort, 0 to 4-year-olds, is at the bottom, and our oldest age cohort, 85 and older, is at the very top. What I've labeled for you on this graphic is the baby boom generation. They're those boomers. And back in 1970, they were young, they were going into college, they were just entering the workforce. The state of Florida's population back then, I want to say off the top of my head, was about 6.5, 7, 8 million. But the baby boom generation, you can see them there. This is a very interesting sort of shift over time. So that's 1970. Let's zoom ahead now 20 years. Strangely enough, when you go ahead 20 years, the baby boomers have aged 20 years, as have anyone that was alive at that time. They are aging through the population 20 years later. They're still a dominant bulge, one that you can pick out in the population cohort. If I were to show you 1970, 1990, you'd begin to see the top thicken out a little bit. But again, we see those baby boomers age. We now zoom ahead to 2010, so our most recent decennial census population pyramid. Those baby boomers still stand out, and you can see that they're very much in play in terms of the workforce. They are our senior leadership. They're many of our elected officials. They're many of the folks that run our corporations, our nonprofits, our local governments, and state governments. And these folks are aging towards retirement. The other thing to note out of this population pyramid is the top is particularly thick. We're living longer, we're attracting older adults to the state for sun, sand, surf, and the lifestyle that we've got here in Florida. And the population pyramid sort of captures some of these ongoing changes. One of the key messages that I tried to get across early on in the talk was that this is destiny, right? We each get older every single day. Next year, we'll all be a year older, should we be lucky enough to still be around. And there's no policy, there's nothing to be done about this. Aging and demographics, in this case, are destiny. Now, a fun little exercise I like to do, and again, just this is, I've shown you state population pyramids, is to, let's look at some counties in Florida. So we're going to look at some interesting population pyramids. And I'm going to describe what we're seeing and then tell you the county, because we can sort of get a sense of what's going on as we travel around the state and how our population pyramids can help us understand what's going on in a given county. This first county very much mirrors the state's population pyramid and in many ways mirrors the US population pyramid as a whole. It's got no really outstanding characteristic. By that I mean there's nothing in there that really stands out. And this is what I call sort of your typical suburban or urban county. So I call these the urban or suburban county balance counties. There's an age balance. There's a gender balance. It looks a lot like the US population pyramid. And you find this in our large counties like Hillsborough County here, which is Tampa, as well as Orange County down in the southeast of Florida, Palm Beach, although they're a little older, Broward, Miami-Dade. So they look a lot like the US as a whole, our big urban and big suburban counties. Again, it's not just urban counties. So this case, the suburban county, Polk County, age balance, gender balance looks a lot like the US population pyramid as a whole. This one looks very different. This is actually a state of Florida county that I'm well familiar with. We see lots and lots of young adults, lots of college-age students in the population, and this is in fact my home county of Leon, where Tallahassee is. If you looked at Alachua, where the University of Florida is, Alachua County, you'd see a very similar layout. Lots and lots of college kids, relatively fewer retirees, otherwise a pretty solid distribution. This is the fountain of youth that is my county. Every 10 years, the population gets older, but we still have this massive bulge of college-age students and young adults that are here studying at FSU, at FAMU, at TCC. So very, very different population pyramid here in Leon County. Here we are starting to see a little bit of difference. This is a population in which we've got sort of this top-heavy, lots of sort of older adults, age 45 to 65. You've got a hollowing out in the middle, sort of the prime working years, 20 to about 45, and then some kids at the bottom. And this is in many ways a classic rural county. There are scholars out there that have talked about sort of left behinds. And what we mean by that is that people that have the drive, the energy, the interest to go pursue education and employment opportunities elsewhere oftentimes leave rural counties. This is Putnam County, although I could have picked many Florida counties that have a look like this. People get to college age and they decide to go elsewhere for education, for work, for lifestyle reasons. So this is a classic rural county, smaller working populations, young adult flight that you can very much pick out in the demographics. This one looks at first glance like a massive mistake of some kind. There's very left-leaning, lots and lots of male residents aged 20 to about 55. And in many ways, this one sort of looks like there's no way a population in a county could look like this. But in fact, we have several counties in the state of Florida that look like this. And this is a mix of rural county and prisons. Lafayette County here in the state, they've got a large state facility in place. And they sort of very much look like they're going to topple over as a population. And this is because of a large prison in that rural county. Next up, we've got a county that has a sort of a bulge at the sort of three waves. You've got your older adult, 50 to 65. You've got sort of younger adults, about 20 to 30, and you've got some kids at the bottom. And this is a military county, Okaloosa County up here in the Panhandle. Lots and lots of younger adults related to the military base there. They have kids and they bring them along with them. So there you can see them in the population pyramid. But then you also see lots of military retirees. Um, we're now getting into the topic that I really wanted to hit on here, and that is retirement-leaning counties. We've got a fatter top here. This is Collier County in Southwest Florida, not Southwest Florida. Lots of retirees, relatively fewer younger adults. It looks a little bit top-heavy. To continue on that, here is hyper retirement land. For those of us that know Florida, and know of the Villages, which is a very, very large retirement community in Central Florida, northwest of Orlando. This is Sumter County, hyper retirement land. This place actually exists. Huge, huge 55 and older communities down there, and they have the wonderful excitement of having lots of older adults that have the means to live there. But they are a hyper retirement community. They also have a prison in Sumter County as well, which is why there's sort of a left leaning, lots of younger males as well, but lots and lots of older adults and far, far fewer younger adults and children in Sumter County. And the one I'm going to end with is one that many of us in the state know. It's one of our lovely counties on the coast. This is Sarasota County. I call this retirement land. They've got a relatively fat base, and by that I mean they've got younger adults. They do have some children. They have sort of working age population. They're a little more top heavy. What makes Sarasota County interesting and really useful for us is that this population pyramid is what Florida is going to look like in the next 15 or 20 years. Much more old, many more older adults, and sort of this top heavy population with more and more folks age 65 and older. So again, population pyramids is a way of understanding your population and demographic mix. Let's now return to the state of Florida as a whole. This was where I left you, state of Florida's population pyramid in 2010. There are those baby boomers aged about 40 to about 60. As we zoom ahead to 2030, again, the Florida's population pyramid is going to look something like Sarasota County's does. We've got the baby boomers have aged fully into their traditional retirement years, although many of them will still be working. We have this bulge in the population. These folks need medical attention, or they have different medical needs, I should say. They have different transportation needs. This cohort has very much sort of shaped our cultural tastes and our housing tastes, and they will continue to do so as they sort of age into their older adult years. Florida is very different than the US as a whole. This is a big, complicated population pyramid. I've got one overlaid on another. The Florida population pyramid is in thick black lines, and it sits on top of the US population pyramid in 2030, which is in green and yellow underneath. And again, the big message here is that we think of Florida as an older state, and in fact, it is. We're much older than the US as a whole. If we sort of look at the state's trajectory, the story I like to tell is that in 1970, the state was ready to, it was a rocket ship ready to take off. And I sort of, when you look at the image of the 1970 population pyramid for Florida, it looks like a rocket ship. Um, and then 2030, I was at a talk many years ago, and somebody said it looks like a mushroom cloud. And there are some folks that look at our demographic trends and think that we've got a demographic time bomb coming. That's a very negative view of things. I tend to look at things a little differently and think that the 2030 population pyramid for the state of Florida is not a challenge, but a wonderful opportunity for the state. And I think one that many of you are trying to embrace in the work that you're doing. We are a national aging policy leader and are doing some great work on that in that area. A lot of these retirees want to continue to work into their older adult years. They want to give back through their volunteering time. The state, I think, is looking for and is finding ways to make use of our older skilled workforce, looking to our community leadership capacity. We've got lots and lots of great CEOs and other leaders that live in the state of that used to work in local government, in the nonprofit sector, and the private sector, and they want to continue to give back. They're high energy, and we're looking to use these folks to help move the state forward as well. The state needs to be, and I think is looking to be, a leader in transportation for the aging. And then we, of course, need to continue innovation on the medical front. And I think the real interesting transition we're seeing with older adults is that we're looking for medical innovation aimed not at what I would call the quality of death, sort of making sure that people age gracefully into their graves, but actually quality of life to ensure that older adults are enjoying a high quality of life, doing the activities that they want to do to their very last day. So Florida is, you can look at the aging population and sort of see concern. I see great opportunity for public policy and for planning. Um, I'm going to skip a slide or two here. I'm just talk real quick about this concept of a dependency ratio. In demographic terms, we think about our working age population of 18 to 64-year-olds, and then we think of kids 0 to 17 as being dependent, and older adults age 65 and older as being dependent, at least traditionally. Um, Florida is somewhat unique in that our mix for our dependency ratio for our dependents is a little bit different. We've got a lot more older adults that are dependent upon the working population than we do children. So just this slide shows Florida relative to the rest of the country in terms of our dependency ratio and its makeup. And again, the big story here is that Florida, our older adults sort of make us unique in our dependency mix. Um, One or two other slides on the silver tsunami. One interesting demographic trend that we anticipate happening in another 5, 10 years here is that projections suggest that in the middle of the next decade, we'll actually have more older adults age 65 and older than residents age 0 to 19. A remarkable thing when you think about it. Our millennial population is indeed growing, but because of those baby boomers, we'll actually have more elderly than we will kids in the state of Florida. That doesn't mean we still don't need schools and parks and all services aimed at those younger age cohorts, but there's some interesting politics and planning implications of this. So there's just a real interesting set of trends here. And again, these are destiny. There's no policy way around this. This is going to happen, and it's a matter of sort of coming to grips and making things work. All right, I'm going to skip a slide and turn my attention to sort of the implications of this. My view is that planners need to, and I think many of you have been working on issues of older adults. I think that there is a real role for planning to support the quality of life for the older adult community. I've got a colleague at FSU, Rebecca Miles, who's been doing work on what are called NORCs, N-O-R-Cs, naturally occurring retirement communities. There are neighborhoods in many cities around the state and around the country, for that matter, that we see a lot of older adults sort of living. They're either aging in place or they sort of find communities where their needs are well met. These are really not planned places. They sort of happen based on sort of market forces and cultural forces. But once they're identified, these are wonderful places to invest in infrastructure and services to support the life of many older adults. So they're sort of good locations for innovative policy and innovative investments to help the lives of older adults. The state needs to continue to, and local governments need to continue to look at providing housing options When they do surveys of older adults, most folks they say they want to age in place. That doesn't necessarily mean that they want to age in their current housing unit, although many of them do. Oftentimes, they just want to be in their same neighborhood, and this is where we really need a mixture of units in place. Smaller apartments for individuals as they downsize. I look at my parents up in Virginia, both in the mid 70s. They're starting to talk about getting out of their very large house that helped them raise 4 kids. They want to stay in their neighborhood, but there aren't a lot of options beyond single family homes. So we need a mixture of housing units in our neighborhoods. Transportation systems and technology that promote older adult mobility, the issue of driver cessation, what happens when you give up the car keys because you need to or because you should. So transportation is a big issue. We need better universal design policy and housing design to allow people to age in their units, grab bars in bathrooms. I think of shelves and access to sort of food and countertops that allow people as they get older and are a little less mobile and have a little less ability to raise their arms above their head. So universal design to help people age in place in their units. And of course, there's a lot of work being done on the medical side of things. I do want to mention, we oftentimes get very wrapped up in this silver tsunami. We have lots and lots of school-age children that we need to remember that education is an issue that we don't want to lose track of. All right, that was topic one. I'm glancing at the clock and seeing where we're on time here. Um, Let's now talk to this browning of America. The slide I've got up on the screen now is an issue of Time magazine, The New Face of America, How Immigrants Are Shaping the World's First Multicultural Society. This is a hot topic these days. What I love about this is that this Time magazine cover is actually not a recent one. It's from all the way back in 1993. So the issue of sort of the demographic and diversity changes to the nation as a whole. This has been something that we've enjoyed and benefited from as a nation from our very beginning. We're a nation that is a melting pot, and this is an issue that will continue to play out moving forward in this country and in this state of Florida. The browning of America. That's the term that's used out there. We've talked about the graying of America. This is sort of the browning of America refers to the rise, the growth of minority populations. And the story here is that just as the U.S. will add its next 100 million people to get to 400 million in the 2040s, in the 2040s, the U.S. is expected to become majority minority. This is a very exciting, wonderful thing for the country. But you can see on this slide sort of the growth of the minority population versus the white population in the U.S. From 1970 and then projected by the Census Bureau through 2050. So some very interesting trends. And again, this is ongoing and very exciting for the country as a whole. When we look at the percent minority by county, we can see the blues here are areas in which the county is greater than the U.S. percent minority, which is 36% for the average county. One of the messages here for Florida is that we are one of the more diverse states, particularly down on the peninsula and up in the Panhandle. You can see that diversity sort of very much varies across the country. The South and then the Sun Belt in the Southwest and the West are more diverse than much of the rest of the country. But again, percent minority, it does vary widely around the country. And the mix of the minority mix changes as you go around the country as well. In the South, we tend to see very large African American populations. In Florida, it's very large Hispanic populations, and that's true out in the Southwest and out in California as well. If we look at change in minority populations in the period 2000 to 2010, again, the big message here is that Florida is very much in the blues, meaning that our growth in minority population is very, very large. And this is true across much of the country as well. So again, the bluer the shade, the greater the growth in their minority population in the last decade. This is some really great work by probably the nation's foremost demographer, William Frey, who's at the Brookings Institute. He's done, has a recent book I'll pitch in a little bit that I think all planners should read. What he's done is sort of tracked the growth of the American population and sort of attributed it to minorities versus whites. The big message here is that in the 2000s, 9 out of every 10, 92% of our population growth was wrapped up or due to minority population growth. We're talking blacks, Asians, Hispanics. He tends to mush together both ethnicity and race, but the message here is that that our population growth as a nation is largely wrapped up in our diversity, and that's a wonderful thing. Um, some other work by Frey. He's looked at, this is for the year 2010, the percentage of infants born in the year 2010 that are non-white. And again, the big story here is that in Florida, we see many of our counties have over, one out of every two or greater of our new residents born into the state are minority. These are trends that are ongoing and set in place. Um, Really neat work, lots going on in this slide. Race, ethnic profiles by age group. If we look at, I'm going to zoom you to the bottom graphic there, the bottom bar. When we look at our oldest age cohort in 2010, we can see that at 85% white and 15% non-white. With each successively younger cohort, we can see that mix gets more and more diverse. And the story here is that when you zoom all the way up to the under 5-year-old cohort, it's roughly evenly split between whites and non-whites, and this trend is set in stone. We are getting browner, we are getting more diverse, and it's a wonderful thing, and it's demographics as destiny. The way he also, again, I steal a lot from Frey's work because he just does such an outstanding job. If we look at the population mix, so there's a lot going on here, race, ethnic composition in 2 time periods, 2012 versus projections by 2060. If you focus primarily on that top pairing of the total population, 2012 versus 2060. In 2012, the country was 63% white, 37% non-white. By 2060, again, we're going to be majority minority, 43% white. The black population is expected not to grow too much. The Asian population is expected to grow some. The 2 or more races subgroup is expected to grow. It's the Hispanic population that's particularly growing fast, not just in Florida, but the U.S. as a whole. Within Florida, we can see sort of the spread of Hispanic population throughout the state. The big message is here is that the Hispanic population is starting to grow in very significant numbers up into the northern part of the state, where it's traditionally not been heavily Hispanic. That's a trend that is ongoing and will continue for the foreseeable future. One of the reasons that the Hispanic population is growing so quickly is borne out by some population pyramids. So we've got here the state of Florida non-Hispanic percent population by age and sex, and then I'll show you the Hispanic population pyramid. And again, the big message here is that Hispanics are much younger than non-Hispanics, which is one of the reasons they're growing so quickly. If we think Florida is changing very quickly, the U.S. Population pyramids for non-Hispanic versus Hispanic is particularly pronounced. In Florida, we actually have a much more age-rich Hispanic population. The U.S. as a whole has a much younger Hispanic population, and that's shown in these population pyramids. So the U.S. Population that is Hispanic is growing very, very, very quickly. And again, this is a demographic destiny. There's no changing this. If you have lots and lots of younger adults, they tend to produce lots and lots of kids. It's a demographic reality. So we're getting much more diverse very quickly across the country. I'm going to skip a few slides in the interest of time to make sure we have a little bit of time at the end for any questions that have come along. So I'm going to zoom through some slides. My apologies for that. Let me just sort of drive home the fact that Florida is a very diverse, wonderful, amazing state. We rank 12th in our population that's percent black. We rank 6th in our population that is Hispanic. We rank 5th in our population that is foreign-born, and we rank 8th in our population that is percent is English not spoken at home. We're a wonderfully rich, diverse state, and that's demographic reality and destiny that will continue to shape us. I'll sort of show you a little cartoon here that I like because I think it puts into stark reality some of the exciting political debates we have about the future of Florida and the United States. Here we've got somebody proposing to make English the official language of the United States. and there are all these different diverse people sort of saying, yeah, let's go ahead and do that, when in fact they're not all speaking English. So some interesting political challenges ahead related to this. In terms of the implications of diversification, if you watch some channels out there on the TV, you'll hear some commentators that make the case that we've got sort of older, good America, white America at war with younger brown America. Um, and I think this is a false sort of assertion to make. There's some really great work that's been done by Bill Frey and a good friend of mine, Dal Myers, who's a professor at the University of Southern California. And I'll sort of draw your attention to that Communities in Banking magazine article on the right-hand side. And Dal Myers in that piece essentially says, the baby boomers need immigrants. Why? Because they're going to be downsizing and they're going to be wanting to sell their house, and they need those immigrant and diverse populations to be economically successful. So it's in the financial best interest for older white America to see success in younger brown America. And I think that's the reality, and I think that's a very exciting thing for the planning community to support and get behind as we move forward in the work we're doing. I now want to turn my attention to the last of my topics, and that is housing and household size. One of the interesting trends we see nationally is that over time, homes have gotten a lot bigger. If we go back to 1975, the average home was only about 1,500 square feet. In 2010, it's about 2,200 square feet. When the economy does well, home sizes tend to get larger. People love their large kitchens and closets and all of that other stuff, and that's wonderful. But at the same time, our homes are getting larger. The reality is our households are getting smaller. If we look at the trend across the country as a whole, back about a century ago, we had about 4 people per household. We're now close to about 2.5 people per household. So we have larger homes with fewer people in them on average. And that's an interesting trend that I think will change our housing mix as we move forward. One of the interesting demographic trends we see has to do with what I call the Leave It to Beaver syndrome. Leave It to Beaver was a particularly classic TV show back in the 1960s about the two parents and the two kids family. I suspect they had a dog as well. And we think of the Leave It to Beaver household as a mom and a dad and some kids. Well, the reality is that Leave It to Beaver as a model is something that's changing. Back in 1960, as shown on this graphic, about 1 in every 2 households had at least one child living in the household. Moving forward, it's going to be closer to 1 in every 4. So instead of a house that needs 3,600 square feet and 4 bedrooms for all the kids, the demographic trends are towards smaller households. And in fact, one of the big fastest growing trends is towards single person households. Back in 1960, only 13% of all households had one resident. In 2025, the projection is that we'll have as many single person households as we will households with children. It's an interesting sort of household mix change. Um, this is a trend that's been documented. A really neat book I recommend to folks on the Singleton Revolution. Eric Kleinenberg has written a book called Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone. This is actually an international trend. It's actually much further along in places of Northern Europe. The Singleton Revolution wraps around not just what we think of as traditional sort of young singles, people out of college that are graduating and decide to live alone, but we also have widows, widowers, we have divorced singles, we have choice singles, people who are choosing to live alone, and that's the lifestyle they aspire to. And this is a fast-growing trend. And again, many of those Singleton households don't need the 1,800 square foot home, don't need the 2,400 square foot home with the 4 bedrooms and the mudroom. They're looking for different types of housing units, and that's a housing trend wrapped up to some degree in our demographics. As we look at our household mix here in Florida and nationally, we see a rise in what are called those singleton households, but we're also seeing a rise in both what are called the sinks and the dinks, the single income, no kid households and the double income, no kids households. There are lots of people that are choosing to live together. They may have 1 or 2 income earners, but they're having no kids. And there are other non-traditional households without kids as well. These household mixes are tending to look for smaller housing units, not always, but are trending towards looking looking for smaller housing units. And we anticipate the demographics mean that the demand for large homes on large lots is in the long run likely to go down. Um, some interesting demographic trends that will change the mix of our housing units that are out there and need to be produced to meet the growing demand for housing. When I look at these changes in household size as a planner, I see great opportunity. So I see demographics as supporting what I call the quality growth agenda. Planners oftentimes talk about a desire for density, more units on less acreage. That doesn't necessarily mean 40-story condo buildings. It can just mean smaller lots for single-family homes or townhomes or garden apartments. But the demographic trends are pointing towards density as a good thing and something that's in demand. With that density will bring a demand for a mix of uses because people are looking to walk and have other access to the grocery store, the drugstore, to shopping, to haircuts, whatever. Um, I also think that we're going to see a change in the housing mix going forward, wrapped up in these demographic trends. And again, when I look longer term, and this is not my idea. Chris Nelson at Georgia Tech, formerly at Georgia Tech, now he's at the University of Arizona. Dal Myers, and lots of other outstanding scholars that are far smarter than I have pointed this for a while. But the message is that demographics are in planning's benefit. The trends are very much in line with what we've been talking about for a long time: density, mixed use, multiple modes of travel, urban reinvestment, and reduced environmental footprint. So there's lots of great opportunity wrapped up in the demographics. Let me now sort of end up with my Southern preacher approach. I've told you what I was going to told you. I've talked for a while now about these trends. I'm going to just sort of hit the high points to make sure you get those. Um, First of all, the big message here is that there are some big demographic trends, and they are reshaping Florida and the U.S. as a whole. And you, as a planner, will be best served if you're aware of these and monitoring these in your own communities. So go gather the data and make sure you know what's going on in your community as you do your work. Um, we are growing. So one of the great benefits and joys of working in Florida and the U.S. as a whole is that we are seeing growing population, and that's going to continue for a long time for the foreseeable future. So growth is continuing, despite some of the scary things that you may hear on the news. The Florida is growing and will continue to grow. We've talked about that silver tsunami, and one of the big messages is that 1 in Floridians will be older adult in the year 2025. There are parts of the state that the number is much, much greater than that. These older adults have specialized travel needs. They have very different needs in terms of their ability to be mobile themselves or ambulatory to move around themselves. There's a lot wrapped up in these older adults and their demands for our communities and for local services. Um, the population is going to continue to diversify. This is something that is very exciting, but may bring some challenges for our communities. Sometimes there are language issues, there may be cultural issues, our housing mix is changing. So diversity is a wonderful thing, but it may make our jobs a little bit more complicated because the mix of folks that we are serving is changing and changing very quickly. And then I also mentioned this household mix. Our households are getting smaller. We've had this rise of singleton households. I really do think this brings some long-term exciting trends for our communities. But this is a very, very substantial trend and something that you should be aware of in your communities. If you are looking for sort of more material to read and learn more about, again, I've largely drawn on the work of lots of other folks. I've mentioned 4 books here that I think are particularly of interest to you. I mentioned Going Solo by Eric Kleinenberg. If you're really interested in demographics and you're a demographic nerd, the William Frey book, Diversity Explosion, is just outstanding. Paul Taylor's The Next America is an interesting, very graphic look at the changing mix of our population. And then Chris Nelson, who I actually studied under at Georgia Tech, has got a book in which he argues that demographics are going to promote a real, substantial redevelopment agenda in the next several decades, and something that we planners should be very attuned to and excited about. So with that, I'm going to turn to some questions that we got from, or just one question we got sent in. So I'm going to refer to that. The question is, do you see a tiny house movement in Florida? Um, I have not. I can see no data on this, but I think the trends are very much pointing to the idea of tiny houses for smaller households. I've seen the show on TV. I'm fascinated by the idea of living in a tiny amount of square footage. I will observe. I'll never do it myself, but there are those out there that will love this, and it's affordable and workable. I've seen no data on this, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to see if there is a rise in tiny houses. I do think that there are some developers out there that have got a very good product mix that's at the smaller housing unit size in terms of townhomes and single family homes. And we're seeing that in neighborhoods in Tampa and in Orlando and in some of our bigger cities. So I don't know of any data on the tiny house movement, but the demographics certainly point to that making sense. So I think that's all the questions we've got. I'm looking at the producers here, and they're suggesting we're good to go. Professor Stevens.
Okay. Um, on behalf of the Emerging Topics Committee and APA Florida, I want to thank Dr. Chapin for joining us today. And I also want to thank you out there in internet land for joining us on today's webinar. Dr. Chapin's presentation is going to be available on the APA Florida website. And I also note that the APA Florida chapter will be sending you a questionnaire by email. We're trying to obtain your feedback about this webinar, so we would really appreciate it if you take a couple of minutes to provide us with your feedback. This is really going to help us serve you as our members in helping provide future webinars and continuing education programming moving forward. I hope you have a great day, and don't forget to claim your CM credits, as I know many of you would love to do. Thanks so much for joining us.